This a continuation to the previous video. My parents and Dan were back sooner than I thought. And they wanted money this time. This will not surprise some people who commented on my previous posts, because my parents did some of the exact things they said they would. Which was wanting either my money, or my signature. I did expect the classic lines of narcissists saying that I owed them, or give me some kind of socialist BS of sharing the wealth. But that was just my imagination running wild. The ensuing situation was somewhat similar to that. But much more tame, I guess you could say. They seemed to know not to push me too far now. And were mostly aiming for pity. It began when my parents recently got in touch with me through social media, and asked for a meeting in a public place of my choosing. It just screamed trap. But I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was amused. They know I'm not to be fucked with anymore. So I could only wonder what they wanted this time. I picked a local restaurant that may have a name of an olive and a garden in it, and we met up there. Dan was with them. But he kept his mouth shut, most of the time. We had awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then cut to the chase. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't so great. Gee, I wonder why. Could it be his wife regularly spends him into a hole? Well, they asked that I help by either supplying some capital, or by co-signing for the apartment and helping to pay the rent for it. I simply said no to both. That's when Dan spoke up in anger and yelled at me that I have so much, and I don't have a family to support like he does. He needed my help, and I should be sparing the money for his family since I don't have one myself. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. That's right. They were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood? I'd love to delve into that with plenty of ears to listen in around us. My mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to speak of any of it. My father and Dan both just looked away and said nothing. Pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to at me, but held their tongues. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something. And their look said it all. And when I told them I don't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer in headlights. I broke it down about how much I'd managed to save for the down payment on my house, and the way I had to live and work in order to save that much so fast. And then how I spent nearly all of it on the down payment of my house. I'm still in financial recovery. I did have monthly income to spare, yes. But most of it was going right into my savings. I asked Dan what his yearly salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I then loosely broke things down in rough math in front of my parents on how about 70% of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gasoline, internet, phone, food, and other bills. And then there's maybe 30% of that left at most that I can put into savings. And I need that money saved to get back on my feet in time. And I have to make sure I have savings to fall back on. My truck is from the 90s. If it were to break down, I'd need money to either fix or replace it. And there's other things one would need a rainy day fund for, like home repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or anything in general you'd need quick cash for when it's a sudden unexpected expense. So, as you can see, I just can't spare money for Dan. And I also refuse to co-sign for anything as that would leave me on the hook for any bill Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. Then I pointed out that, that's likely why my parents didn't co-sign for Dan's apartment themselves long ago. And my mother just started crying again. I was pretty much one step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not a fool. And I stated that right to their faces. I expected my father to become angry with me like he always does. But this time he just, well, didn't. I've known this man to explode on me for the slightest provocation of not enabling my brother all of my life. But this time he just didn't do that. There wasn't even a sneer on his face. The only way I could describe the look he had was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being a shitty parent. Or maybe regret because he can't bully me around anymore. Who knows? Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't about to give them any money. Dan just got up and said this was all just a waste of their time, and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Dan still wanted to leave. Then, just to kill with kindness, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all there. I guess they couldn't turn down free food since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks yet, and they stayed. I went out of my way to talk about anything other than money. Dan remained quiet, and was either eating his food or looking at his phone. But my parents just awkwardly talked with me. They brought up that they've recently joined a local Christian church. And that they'd already been going for the last 2 weeks. I said, good for them, and they of course started trying to advertise that they'd like me to go too. I simply said no thanks, and they were smart enough not to push further. When the meal was finished, Dan left a $10 on the table for the tip and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior and we all parted ways. That was about it. Not nearly as much drama as I thought there'd be. But this is still far better than how things used to be with my parents and brother. As for sister-in-law, well, she's been regularly complaining online about my parents. She really doesn't seem to like the fact that she's not queen bee of their house. And I think her toxic is finally getting to them. Why else would they be so desperate to come crawling back to me? Sister-in-law actually wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to do in order to make space in the house. And she's being told no, every time. She does seem to have a following of Karen-minded people like her though. Because here and there I get messaged by someone I don't know, that are intent on raging at me for not giving up my house for sister-in-law. I don't bother to argue with these people anymore. I just block and move on. Though there was one persistent troll who had my phone number. And they call from a different number every time. Yes, it seems to be the same person who called me to say I need to make way for a real family man like Dan. But I could care less. The calls though, seem to have slowed down, if not maybe stopped. Because I made it clear to that person that they were only amusing me by keeping this up so long. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month. And it's been silence from them since then. Well, I figured I'd wait half a year or so after the original posts to update everyone. But it ended up being longer than that. Yes, things did go bad again. But not really for me for the most part. I'm pretty much fine, if not almost unscathed since last Christmas, apart from the time my parents and Dan came to me for money, as my last post told, and a more recent confrontation between me and Sil you will read about here. I did get a few cameras for my house, including a Ring doorbell in front. I didn't tell my family about the cameras just in case, but thus far no one has attempted a break-in. I think the way I outed them all before scared them into leaving me alone, for the most part anyway. I've taken to renting out 2 of the rooms in my house. One to a close friend, the other to a friend of said close friend. Both have been fantastic tenants. They know to keep quiet and leave me alone most of the time, and even have small refrigerators they keep in their rooms so they don't need to keep any of their drinks in the main fridge. The deal I gave them on rent was too good for them to pass up. It increased my monthly income well. And even after taxes, I'm still monthly putting away some decent amounts in the bank since the rent money pays a good chunk of my monthly mortgage. You're all probably wondering how my parents, brother and sister-in-law took to me renting out those rooms to friends. Well, the answer is, not well. My father and Dan stayed out of it. But sister-in-law freaked out, which made my mother come crying to me over how I could have rented those rooms to Dan and his family instead. We had a bit of an argument in which I pointed out for one thing, they fucking broke into my house before to try and steal it. She wouldn't want to let someone who did that move in with her. Also, there wasn't enough room for me, Dan, and his entire family in my house. Not that I'd ever share a roof with them anyway. It's a 3-bedroom, and a manufactured home no less. I have the master bedroom and its adjoining bathroom. That would have left only 2 small rooms for Dan, Sil, and 4 kids. Not to mention they'd be annoying AF to me all the time. Also, she knows very well I can't be around SIL because she intentionally antagonizes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless before. Besides, my current tenants are both single guys in their 30s I get along with. My mother had some sobbing excuses for a while. But she finally let it go and admitted she was just desperate. Edit. Parents found out I was renting rooms out because sister-in-law basically stalked me in some way. Then she told my parents, and then my parents contacted me. And then my mother came over to cry about it. Since then my parents haven't bothered me once about the house. So things are good for me. My parents and Dan, not so much. It turns out sister-in-law is a far worse person than even I thought. I already knew she was a gaslighting self-victimizing drama queen. But she sank even lower. Because Dan's youngest child turned out not to be his. Yeah, you all read that correctly. Sister-in-law had an affair. Which in retrospect isn't all that surprising. And something a few people here totally called months ago. After being caught, SIL was ousted from the family. Dan just recently finished with his divorce. Which actually went in his favor since we thankfully live in an at-fault state. Dan also sued to get his name taken off the birth certificate of the youngest child, and won. Basically, after the incident where my parents tried to force me to hand over my house, things got pretty tumultuous over at their house. SIL blamed me, a lot. She was convinced somehow that I had tons of money, like I'd won the lottery or something, and that I should share the wealth. Apparently it was her idea that they come to my Christmas party, because she hoped they could all try to get on my good side. It was also her idea to make my parents and Dan try to get money from me for an apartment. So it really burst her bubble when Dan and my parents informed her of how my finances actually were. For the longest time she had Dan and my parents fully engulfed in her toxic mindset, and only fed their narcissism with her own. So her blaming me made the rest of them blame me. That is until what happened in front of the police when they tried to steal my house. That's when the downfall for SIL really started. My parents and Dan were apprehensive about coming to my Christmas party after the way I'd outed them. But SIL convinced them to just throw together a few cheap gifts from what they could get at the last minute and just show up, because he'd never throw us out once we're already there. Boy was she wrong. She gambled on that plan, and I with the complete blessings of everyone I'd invited threw her and the rest of them out. Her plan she no doubt thought was the most clever thing ever, backfired in her face spectacularly. I guess being chewed out by family at my party not only wrecked my parents' reputation even more, it actually started a wake-up call for them to eventually not listen to sister-in-law anymore. And as I said in my last post, my parents decided on going back to church. Perhaps because last year I'd said they'd probably go to hell for their actions. I can't say that's the real reason. But you got to admit, it would feel kind of satisfying if that was the case. Though my parents hadn't been to church in 2 decades before going back. While I don't think it's a bad idea that they're going to church, they need to understand that going doesn't just give them a do-over for all the shit they've done in the past. But I have a little faith they're at least trying, because my parents came to my house without Dan to personally apologize to me after they'd seen an animated video of my first 3 posts. That's right, they've known about this Reddit account for a long time now. They also know everything I'm saying. Yes, they're unhappy about it. But I feel everyone here deserves an update since it's anonymous. For my parents and Dan though, watching an animated video of themselves and their own actions was a great way to make them see what kind of people they really are. And they came over to apologize to me later. I'd never seen my father apologize like that to anyone. And the man isn't a good actor. So this felt genuine. They fully acknowledged what they did to me, and how there's no excuse for any of it. They even described themselves as narcissists, and admitted the truth that they had wronged me very badly. Then they went on to blame SIL for a lot of things. Yeah, they kind of threw her under the bus. But it's not like she wasn't guilty of everything they said. My parents have been getting counseling for a while now too, and did offer group family counseling. But I declined as I'm not ready for that anytime soon. Dan himself didn't apologize to me for some time. But he looked extremely remorseful any time the past was brought up. Meanwhile, Dan and sister-in-law marriage absolutely fell apart. It wasn't a crumble, it was a cascade. Without me as the scapegoat, black sheep, ATM, that they couldn't mock or try to get money from anymore. And after the public humiliation of social media, my Reddit posts, and the animated online video, sister-in-law finally let out enough of her toxic on Dan and my parents for them to realize she's not the person they thought she was. Their denial had been strong. But sister-in-law's entitlement was stronger. I've had many a thought of lightsabers clashing over this drama. Sister-in-law clad like a bimbo Seth with a lightsaber that looks like a giant lipstick or something like that. I imagine there's a wealth of puns and jokes to be had there, but I really didn't bother to think much more detail about it.